The radio crackled with static as 12 enemy aircraft appeared on her radar screen like angry wasps. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez gripped the controls of her F-16 Fighting Falcon, her heart pounding as fuel leaked from her damaged wing. Behind her, the voices of male pilots who had once called her too weak to handle real combat now screamed warnings through the radio. She was about to prove them all wrong in the most spectacular way possible. What happened next would change military aviation forever and force an entire nation to rewrite the rules about who could defend their skies. This is the true story of how one woman turned the greatest challenge of her life into the most decisive air battle. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as Sarah Martinez walked toward the briefing room, her flight helmet tucked under her arm. At 26 years old, she stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed barely 120 pounds. To most people passing by, she looked like she might work in the base administration office or perhaps the medical facility. Nobody would guess that she was about to become the first woman to fly combat missions in an F-16 Fighting Falcon. The year was 1994, and the United States military was slowly opening combat roles to women. The decision had sparked heated debates across the country and within the military itself. Many argued that women simply didn't have the physical strength or mental toughness needed for air-to-air combat. Others worried that having women in combat units would destroy unit cohesion and put everyone at risk. Sarah had heard all the arguments before. She had been hearing them for the past 8 years, ever since she first walked into the Air Force Academy as an 18-year-old cadet from a small town in Texas. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a school teacher. Nobody in her family had ever served in the military, let alone dreamed of becoming a fighter pilot. Growing up, Sarah had always been fascinated by airplanes. She would spend hours lying on her back in the family's backyard, watching military jets streak across the Texas sky during training exercises. Her bedroom walls were covered with pictures of fighter aircraft, and she could identify every plane by its silhouette. When her high school guidance counselor asked what she wanted to do after graduation, Sarah's answer was immediate. She wanted to fly. The counselor had smiled politely and suggested she consider becoming a flight attendant or perhaps working for an airline. The idea of a woman becoming a military pilot seemed so far-fetched that it wasn't even worth discussing. But Sarah had done her research. She knew that women were already flying transport planes and tankers for the Air Force. Combat aircraft were still off-limits, but she figured that would change eventually. She was right, but the path to get there had been far more difficult than she had ever imagined. At the Air Force Academy, Sarah had excelled academically, but struggled with some of the physical requirements. She was strong for her size, but when it came to pure upper body strength, she couldn't match most of her male classmates. During survival training, she had to work twice as hard to keep up during obstacle courses and endurance challenges. Some instructors seemed to take pleasure in pointing out her limitations, as if proving that women didn't belong in military aviation. But Sarah had one advantage that many of her classmates lacked, an almost supernatural ability to understand how aircraft worked. While other cadets struggled with aerodynamics and flight mechanics, Sarah seemed to have an intuitive grasp of how air moved over wings and how thrust, drag, lift, and weight interacted to keep a several-ton machine flying through the sky. Her first flight in a training aircraft had confirmed what her instructors already suspected. Sarah Martinez was a natural pilot. She had smooth hands on the controls, excellent spatial awareness, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. By the time she graduated from the academy in 1990, she was at the top of her pilot training class. For the next 4 years, Sarah flew cargo planes and transport aircraft. She accumulated over 2,000 flight hours and earned a reputation as one of the most skilled pilots in her squadron. When the ban on women in combat was finally lifted in 1993, Sarah immediately volunteered for fighter training. The Air Force, eager to show that the new policy would work, selected her as one of the first women to attempt F-16 qualification. The training had been brutal. The F-16 was unlike any aircraft Sarah had ever flown. It was a high-performance machine capable of flying at twice the speed of sound and pulling 9 times the force of gravity during tight turns. The physical demands were enormous. During high-G maneuvers, Sarah's 120-pound body would suddenly weigh over half a ton, pressing her down into her ejection seat with crushing force. Many of her male colleagues had quietly bet that she would wash out of the program. The G-forces alone, they argued, would be too much for a woman's smaller frame to handle. Some were more vocal in their opposition. Captain Rick Thompson, a veteran F-16 pilot with over 5 years of combat experience, had made it clear that he thought the whole experiment was a mistake. "Look, I've got nothing against women," Thompson had told a group of pilots during a break between training sessions. "But combat flying isn't about being politically correct. It's about life and death. When you're pulling 8GS in a dogfight, you need every ounce of strength you can get. And when you're in a real shooting war, you can't afford to worry about whether your wingman has the physical capability to keep up." Thompson's comments had been reported to the squadron commander, but no disciplinary action was taken. The sentiment he expressed was shared by many pilots, and the military was still figuring out how to handle the transition to integrated combat units. Sarah tried to ignore the skepticism and focus on her training. She spent extra hours in the gym, working with specialized equipment designed to help pilots cope with high G-forces. She studied aircraft systems until she knew every switch, gauge, and warning light in the F-16 cockpit. She practiced emergency procedures until she could respond to any malfunction without conscious thought. Slowly, her performance began to win over some of her critics. During air-to-air combat simulations, Sarah consistently scored in the top 10% of her class. Her shooting accuracy was exceptional, and her tactical awareness was among the best her instructors had ever seen. She had an uncanny ability to keep track of multiple aircraft during complex dogfights, and seemed to always know where threats were coming from. But physical limitations remained a concern. During one particularly intense training flight, Sarah had blacked out briefly while pulling a sharp turn at high speed. The G-forces had overwhelmed her cardiovascular system, causing blood to pool in her lower body and temporarily cutting off circulation to her brain. She had recovered quickly and completed the mission successfully, but the incident had been noted in her training records. "She's a good pilot," her primary instructor, Major James Rodriguez, had written in his evaluation. "Possibly one of the best natural aviators I've ever trained. But there are legitimate questions about her ability to consistently handle the extreme physical demands of air-to-air combat. In a real engagement, a moment of unconsciousness could be fatal, not just for her, but for other members of her flight." The evaluation had nearly ended Sarah's fighter pilot career before it began. A medical review board was convened to determine whether she should continue with F-16 training or be transferred back to transport aircraft. For 3 weeks, Sarah underwent extensive testing while doctors tried to determine if there was a way to help her cope better with high G-forces. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rebecca Chun, an aerospace medicine specialist, had been studying how different body types responded to G-forces. Her research suggested that while smaller pilots like Sarah might be more susceptible to G-induced loss of consciousness, they also recovered more quickly and could potentially develop better tolerance through specialized training. Dr. Chun recommended a modified training program that would gradually increase Sarah's exposure to high G-forces while teaching her advanced techniques for maintaining blood flow to her brain. The program would take an additional 6 months to complete, but it might allow Sarah to overcome her physical limitations. Sarah jumped at the opportunity. For the next 6 months, she spent nearly every day in a centrifuge, spinning at high speeds while practicing the muscle contractions and breathing techniques that would help her stay conscious during extreme maneuvers. The training was exhausting and often painful, but Sarah's determination never wavered. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging simulation. Sarah was flying a mock combat mission against 2 experienced F-16 pilots when she found herself in a situation that required a sharp 9G turn to avoid being shot down. In the past, such a maneuver would have caused her to black out. This time, she remained fully conscious and alert throughout the turn, successfully evading her opponents and positioning herself for a counterattack. Word of Sarah's improvement spread quickly through the F-16 community. Even some of her harshest critics began to admit that she might actually have what it took to succeed as a fighter pilot. Captain Thompson, who had been among the most vocal opponents of women in combat, grudgingly acknowledged that Sarah's skills were impressive. "I still think this whole thing is a mistake," he told Major Rodriguez after watching Sarah's performance during a training exercise. "But I have to admit, she can fly. If we're going to have women in fighters, at least this one knows what she's doing." It was hardly a ringing endorsement, but for Sarah, it represented progress. She had spent years proving herself to skeptics, and she was beginning to win them over one flight at a time. In March 1995, Sarah finally received her combat certification and was assigned to the 421st Fighter Squadron based at Hill Air Force Base in Utah. She was the squadron's first female pilot, and her arrival was met with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and cautious acceptance. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Harrison, called Sarah into his office on her first day. Harrison was a decorated combat veteran who had flown missions during the Gulf War. He had a reputation for being fair but demanding, and Sarah knew that her future in the squadron would largely depend on how well she performed under his command. "Lieutenant Martinez," Harrison began, settling into his chair behind a desk covered with flight schedules and maintenance reports. "I want to be clear about something from the start. I don't care whether you're a man or a woman. What I care about is whether you can do the job. This squadron has a mission to defend American airspace and be ready to deploy anywhere in the world on short notice. Every pilot in this unit has to be capable of performing that mission effectively." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand. I've read your training reports," Harrison continued. "Your instructors say you're one of the best pilots they've ever worked with. That's good, because you're going to need every bit of that skill. Some of the pilots in this squadron are still not convinced that women belong in combat aircraft. You're going to have to prove yourself all over again, and the standard is going to be high." "I wouldn't expect anything less, sir," Sarah replied. The transport plane touched down on the remote airstrip just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Sarah Martinez gathered her equipment and followed her squadron mates down the cargo ramp onto the tarmac of Forward Operating Base Eagle, a hastily constructed military installation that had been carved out of the desert just 3 months earlier. The base was a collection of temporary buildings, aircraft hangars, and defensive positions surrounded by razor wire and concrete barriers. Everything had a hurried, improvised quality that spoke to the urgency of the situation that had brought them here. Intelligence reports suggested that hostile forces in the region were planning a major offensive that could threaten vital shipping lanes and allied nations. Sarah's F-16, along with 11 others from the 421st Fighter Squadron, had been transported on cargo aircraft and were already being reassembled by maintenance crews. The sight of her aircraft sitting on the flight line filled Sarah with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. After months of training and preparation, she was finally about to face the ultimate test of her abilities. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison gathered the squadron in a briefing room that evening to outline their mission. Maps covered the walls, showing the geography of the surrounding region and the locations of friendly and potentially hostile forces. Red pins marked suspected enemy positions, while blue pins showed Allied bases and important strategic locations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the gravity of their situation. "We're here because our intelligence services believe that hostile forces are preparing to launch a major attack within the next few weeks. Our job is to maintain air superiority over this region and be ready to respond to any threats that develop." He pointed to a map showing their area of operations. "We'll be flying regular combat air patrols, maintaining a constant presence in the airspace around key strategic targets. We'll also be on standby for close air support missions if ground forces come under attack. This is not a training exercise. Any aircraft we encounter that displays hostile intent will be engaged and destroyed." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as the reality of the situation sank in. After years of simulated combat and practice missions, she was about to face real enemies who would be trying to kill her. Captain Rick Thompson, who had been among Sarah's harshest critics during training, raised his hand. "Sir, what's our intelligence on enemy aircraft capabilities?" Harrison nodded toward an intelligence officer who stepped forward with additional briefing materials. "Based on our latest information," the officer explained, We expect to face primarily Russian-built fighters, including MiG-29s and some older MiG-21s. These aircraft are capable and well-maintained, and the pilots have significant combat experience from previous conflicts in the region. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from weapons loadouts to emergency procedures. Sarah took careful notes, paying particular attention to the rules of engagement and the identification procedures for distinguishing between friendly and hostile aircraft. As the meeting broke up, several pilots gathered around Sarah. To her surprise, most of their comments were supportive rather than skeptical. "You ready for this?" asked Lieutenant Mark Stevens, a pilot who had initially been cool towards Sarah but had gradually come to respect her abilities. "As ready as anyone can be," Sarah replied honestly. "You'll do fine," said Captain Lisa Rodriguez, another pilot whose presence had helped Sarah feel less isolated in the male-dominated squadron. "You've got the skills, and you've put in the work. Just fly the way you've been trained and trust your instincts." The first few days at Forward Operating Base Eagle fell into a routine of regular patrols and maintenance work. Sarah flew twice daily, usually paired with different wingmen as the squadron rotated through various formations and patrol patterns. The flights were tense but uneventful, with no hostile aircraft detected in their area of operations. During her off-duty hours, Sarah spent time studying intelligence reports and reviewing aircraft performance data. She wanted to understand everything possible about the enemies she might face and the capabilities of their aircraft. The MiG-29, in particular, was a formidable opponent. It was fast, maneuverable, and equipped with sophisticated weapon systems. The waiting was almost harder than actual combat would have been. Every day brought new intelligence reports suggesting that an attack was imminent, but nothing materialized. The tension was beginning to wear on everyone, and Sarah could see the strain in her fellow pilots' faces during briefings and meals. On October 15th, everything changed. Sarah was awakened at 0400 hours by the base alarm system. Red lights flashed throughout the temporary buildings as the loudspeaker announced an immediate scramble for all available aircraft. Sarah dressed quickly and ran toward the flight line, where maintenance crews were already preparing the F-16s for immediate departure. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was standing near the Squadron Operations Center, talking rapidly into a radio handset while studying a tactical display screen. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked as she approached. "Large formation of unidentified aircraft approaching from the northeast," Harrison replied without looking away from the display. "At least 20 contacts, possibly more. They're flying a direct course toward Allied Base Alpha, about 200 miles from here." Allied Base Alpha was a major installation that housed several thousand coalition forces and served as a key logistics hub for operations throughout the region. If it came under attack, the consequences could be catastrophic. "We're launching everything we've got," Harrison continued. 12 aircraft in 3 flights of 4. "Sarah, you're flying wing with Captain Thompson in Alpha Flight. Stevens and Rodriguez will be your other flight members." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized she was about to experience her first real combat mission. Years of training had led to this moment, and she was determined to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. The pre-flight preparations that normally took 30 minutes were completed in less than 10. Sarah conducted a rapid but thorough inspection of her aircraft while maintenance crews loaded weapons and topped off fuel tanks. Within 20 minutes of the initial alarm, 12 F-16s were lined up on the runway ready for takeoff. "Alpha Flight, this is Eagle Base," came the voice of the air traffic controller over the radio. "You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Contact AWACS on frequency 285.4 for tactical control." Sarah's F-16 lifted off the runway in formation with 3 other aircraft as the first rays of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. As they climbed to altitude, she could see the other 2 flights taking off behind them, their engines creating trails of flame in the early morning darkness. AWACS was an airborne warning and control aircraft that would coordinate the overall battle and provide real-time intelligence about enemy movements. As Alpha Flight reached cruising altitude, Captain Thompson contacted the AWACS controller. "Hammer Control, this is Alpha Flight of 4, checking in," Thompson radioed. "Alpha Flight, Hammer Control. We show hostile aircraft bearing 045 degrees, range 120 miles, altitude Angels 25. Large formation, count at least 18 aircraft. You are cleared to intercept and engage per rules of engagement. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the reality of the situation hit her. In less than 15 minutes, she would be in her first air-to-air combat engagement. Everything she had trained for over the past 5 years was about to be put to the ultimate test. Alpha 2, Alpha 3, Alpha 4, this is Alpha 1, came Thompson's voice over the radio. Arm your weapons and prepare for engagement. Stay tight and watch your targets carefully. We're going to hit them head-on and break up their formation before they can reach Alpha Base. Sarah flipped the master arm switch on her weapons panel and felt the aircraft's radar lock onto the approaching enemy formation. Her F-16 was loaded with 6 air-to-air missiles and 500 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition. More than enough firepower to handle multiple targets if necessary. Alpha 2, contact bearing 048, range 90 miles, she radioed, confirming her radar had detected the enemy aircraft. Roger, Alpha 2. I see them too, replied Stevens from Alpha 3. As they closed the distance to the enemy formation, more details became available from the AWACS aircraft. The hostile force consisted of 16 MiG-29 fighters and 6 older MiG-21s, flying in a loose formation toward the Allied base. It was a substantial attacking force, and Sarah realized that their small flight of 4 F-16s would be heavily outnumbered. Hammer Control, Alpha 1. We're going to need support, Thompson radioed to the AWACS controller. Alpha 1, Hammer Control. Bravo and Charlie. The explosion from Sarah's first kill lit up the morning sky like a deadly firework, but there was no time to celebrate. 3 more enemy MiG-29s were already turning toward Alpha Flight, their radar warning receivers screaming alerts as they detected the F-16 formation's targeting systems. Alpha 2, break right. Captain Thompson's urgent voice cut through the radio chatter as a MiG-29 fired a missile in Sarah's direction. Sarah yanked her control stick hard to the right and pulled back, sending her F-16 into a crushing 8G turn. The anti-G suit inflated around her legs and torso, forcing blood back toward her brain to keep her conscious during the extreme maneuver. Even with all her training, the physical stress was enormous, and she could feel the edges of her vision beginning to tunnel. The enemy missile streaked past her aircraft, missing by less than 100 feet before its proximity fuse detonated harmlessly in empty air. Sarah completed her turn and immediately began scanning for threats, her head swiveling back and forth as she tried to keep track of multiple aircraft maneuvering at supersonic speeds. Alpha 3 is hit. Stevens' voice was tight with pain and stress. I'm losing hydraulics and fuel. I need to get out of here. Sarah looked in Stevens' direction and saw his F-16 trailing a stream of dark smoke from its engine. A MiG-21 was pursuing him, trying to line up for a finishing shot. Without thinking, Sarah turned toward the threat and fired one of her remaining missiles. Fox 3, defending Alpha 3, she radioed as the missile guided toward the MiG-21. The enemy pilot saw the incoming weapon and tried to evade, but Sarah's shot was perfectly timed. The missile struck the MiG-21 in the engine section, and the aircraft disintegrated in another spectacular explosion. Thanks, Alpha 2, Stevens radioed. I'm heading for home. Sarah watched Stevens' damaged F-16 turn away from the battle and begin a slow descent toward the base, trailing smoke, but still flying. She had saved her squadron mate's life, but the engagement was far from over. Alpha Flight, this is Hammer Control, came the voice of the AWACS controller. Be advised, second wave of hostile aircraft approaching from the northwest. Count 12 more fighters, ETA 5 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. They were already outnumbered by the first wave of enemy aircraft, and now another 12 fighters were joining the battle. The situation was rapidly becoming desperate. Roger, Hammer Control, Thompson replied. Where are Bravo and Charlie flights? Bravo Flight is engaging the second wave. Charlie Flight is still 15 minutes out. Sarah realized that her flight was essentially on its own against the remaining aircraft from the first wave. A quick glance at her tactical display showed at least 10 enemy fighters still in the area, with more arriving every minute. Alpha 2, Alpha 4, form up on me, Thompson ordered. We need to stay together and pick our targets carefully. Sarah maneuvered her F-16 into formation with Thompson and Rodriguez, who was flying as Alpha 4. The three aircraft flew in a tight defensive formation while scanning for targets and threats. The next phase of the battle was a series of high-speed turning fights as F-16s and MiGs maneuvered for position. Sarah found herself engaged with a particularly aggressive MiG-29 pilot who seemed determined to get a shot at her aircraft. The two fighters spiraled around each other in a vertical climbing fight, each pilot pulling maximum G-forces as they tried to gain the advantage. Sarah's smaller size, which had been seen as a disadvantage during training, actually helped her during the sustained high-G maneuvering. While the enemy pilot was struggling with the physical effects of the extreme forces, Sarah remained alert and focused. She managed to reverse the fight and get behind the MiG-29, setting up for a gunshot with her 20mm cannon. "Guns, guns, guns," she called out as she opened fire. The stream of cannon shells struck the MiG-29's wing and fuselage, causing significant damage but not destroying the aircraft immediately. The enemy pilot rolled inverted and dove toward the ground, trying to escape. Sarah followed, keeping her cannon trained on the damaged fighter. A second burst of cannon fire finished the job. The MiG-29's fuel tank exploded, sending the aircraft tumbling toward the earth in pieces. Sarah had scored her third kill of the engagement, but she was now running low on ammunition and fuel. "Alpha 2, what's your state?" Thompson asked, using pilot terminology for fuel and weapon status. 3,000 pounds fuel, 2 missiles remaining, 200 rounds of cannon, Sarah replied. It wasn't much for a battle that showed no signs of ending soon. All around her, aircraft were still engaged in individual dogfights as the larger air battle continued to rage. "Hammer control, Alpha 1, Thompson radioed. We need immediate support. We're running low on everything, and there are still multiple bandits in the area." "Alpha 1, hammer control. Charlie flight is accelerating and should be with you in 10 minutes. Can you hold on that long?" 10 minutes felt like an eternity in an air battle where life and death decisions had to be made in seconds. But Thompson's response was immediate and professional. "Roger, we'll make it work." Sarah admired her flight leader's calm confidence even as the situation continued to deteriorate. Her radar warning receiver was constantly chirping, indicating that enemy aircraft were trying to lock their weapons onto her F-16. She had to keep maneuvering aggressively to avoid being shot down, but each violent turn consumed more fuel. The tide of the battle began to shift when Bravo flight arrived and engaged the second wave of enemy aircraft. Suddenly, the F-16s had numerical parity with their opponents, and their superior training and technology began to show. Sarah watched as 2 more enemy fighters were shot down in quick succession by pilots from Bravo flight. The remaining MiGs seemed to lose their coordination, with several aircraft turning away from the battle and heading back toward their own territory. "All aircraft, this is Hammer Control," the AWACS controller announced. "Multiple hostile aircraft are withdrawing to the northeast. Pursue and engage as fuel and weapons permit." Sarah checked her fuel gauge again and realized she was approaching the point where she would need to return to base soon. But she still had 2 missiles remaining, and there were enemy aircraft within range. "Alpha 1, Alpha 2, I can stay in the fight for another 5 minutes, she radioed to Thompson. "Roger, Alpha 2. Let's make those minutes count." Sarah spotted a MiG-21 trying to escape the battle area and maneuvered to intercept. The older Soviet fighter was fast in a straight line, but couldn't turn with the F-16, and Sarah quickly gained a firing position. Her 4th missile of the day streaked away from H-3 days after the first major air battle. Sarah Martinez was leading a 4-ship formation of F-16s on what intelligence had described as a routine reconnaissance patrol. The mission was supposed to be simple: fly a predetermined route along the border region, gather photographic intelligence of enemy positions, and return to base without engaging hostile forces unless absolutely necessary. The morning briefing had been unusually quiet. Intelligence officers reported that enemy air activity had decreased significantly since their decisive defeat earlier in the week, and satellite imagery suggested that many hostile aircraft had been withdrawn to bases further inland. It seemed that the enemy had decided to avoid direct confrontation with American fighters after losing so many aircraft in the initial engagement. Sarah had been assigned as flight leader for the mission, a responsibility that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. But her performance in combat had earned her the respect of the squadron leadership and her fellow pilots. Even those who had been most skeptical of women in combat roles now acknowledged that she had proven herself beyond any doubt. Flying as her wingman was Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a recent addition to the squadron who had arrived just 2 days before the conflict began. Walsh was an experienced pilot with over 3 years of F-16 flying time, but this was her first deployment to a combat zone. The other 2 pilots in the formation, Captain Mike Chun and Lieutenant Dave Wilson, were flying as Elements 3 and 4. As the formation climbed to their patrol altitude, Sarah reviewed the mission parameters one more time. They would fly northwest for approximately 200 miles, photograph suspected enemy installations using their aircraft's reconnaissance pods, then return via a different route to avoid establishing predictable flight patterns. Reaper Flight, this is Eagle Base, came the voice of their controller over the radio. Your mission is approved as briefed. Contact Hammer Control on 285.4 for traffic advisories. Eagle Base, Reaper 1 copies. Switching to Hammer Control, Sarah replied. The first hour of the patrol proceeded exactly as planned. The 4 F-16s maintained formation at 25,000 feet, while their cameras captured detailed images of roads, buildings, and vehicle movements below. Sarah was pleased with Walsh's performance as her wingman. The younger pilot maintained perfect formation position and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that marked a professional aviator. Reaper 1, this is Hammer Control, came the voice of the AWACS controller as they approached the midpoint of their patrol route. Be advised, we're picking up some intermittent radar contacts to your northeast, but nothing definitive. Continue mission as planned. Sarah acknowledged the transmission, but made a mental note to pay extra attention to her radar warning receiver. Enemy forces had been known to use sophisticated electronic warfare techniques to mask their aircraft's radar signatures, making them difficult to detect until they were very close. 20 minutes later, as the formation began its turn toward home, Sarah's radar warning receiver suddenly erupted in urgent beeping tones. Multiple aircraft were illuminating her formation with targeting radars, and they were close. Reaper Flight, this is Reaper 1, Sarah broadcast immediately. We've got multiple locks from the northeast. Execute defensive, turn left now. The 4 F-16s rolled into a sharp left turn just as Sarah's radar screen lit up with contact symbols. 8 enemy fighters had somehow approached to within 30 miles without being detected by the AWACS aircraft. It was a carefully planned ambush, and Sarah realized they had flown directly into a trap. Hammer Control, Reaper 1, Sarah radioed urgently. We have 8 bandits at our 12 o'clock, 30 miles. Request immediate support. Reaper 1, Hammer Control. We're not seeing anything on our scope. Are you sure those are hostile contacts? Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what had happened. The enemy was using electronic jamming to blind the AWACS radar, while keeping their own aircraft hidden until the last possible moment. Her formation was on its own against superior numbers and had lost the element of surprise. Hammer Control, Reaper 1. Confirm 8 hostile aircraft, now 25 miles, and closing. We are engaged. Even as she spoke, missiles began streaking toward her formation from the attacking aircraft. Sarah could see the white trails of at least 4 weapons heading in their direction. Reaper Flight, missiles inbound, she called out. Break right, and chaff. The F-16s scattered in different directions as each pilot maneuvered aggressively to avoid the incoming missiles. Sarah pulled her aircraft into a crushing turn while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the enemy weapons guidance systems. 2 of the missiles missed completely, fooled by the electronic countermeasures and violent maneuvering. But the 3rd missile detonated close enough to Lieutenant Wilson's F-16 to cause significant damage. Sarah heard his urgent radio call as his aircraft began to lose control. Reaper 4 is hit. I've got engine fire and hydraulic failure. I need to get out of here. Sarah watched Wilson's F-16 turn away from the battle area, trailing smoke and losing altitude rapidly. The young pilot was fighting to keep his damaged aircraft in the air long enough to reach friendly territory. Reaper 4, head for Eagle Base, Sarah ordered. We'll cover your withdrawal. But even as she spoke, Sarah realized that covering Wilson's retreat would be nearly impossible. The remaining 3 F-16s were now facing 8 enemy fighters in a running battle that was moving deeper into hostile territory with each passing minute. The enemy had planned their ambush well. They had positioned themselves between Sarah's formation and the route back to base, forcing the American fighters to fight their way through superior numbers if they wanted to escape. Reaper 2, 3, form up on me, Sarah commanded. We're going to punch through them and get home. Walsh and Chun maneuvered their aircraft into formation with Sarah as she turned toward the enemy fighters. It was a desperate move, but their only alternative was to allow themselves to be gradually surrounded and picked off one at a time. Sarah selected her first target, a MiG-29 that was turning to intercept their formation, and fired one of her medium-range missiles. The weapon guided perfectly, striking the enemy fighter in the fuselage and destroying it instantly. Fox 3, Reaper 1. That's one down, she announced. But the victory was short-lived. 2 more enemy fighters were positioning themselves for shots at Walsh's F-16, and Sarah realized her wingman was in serious trouble. Reaper 2, you've got 2 bandits coming in from your 4 o'clock, Sarah warned. Walsh turned to engage the threats, but was immediately forced into defensive maneuvering as missiles streaked toward her aircraft. She managed to avoid the first weapon, but the second missile detonated close enough to damage her left wing and engine. Reaper 2 has battle damage, Walsh reported, her voice tight with stress. I'm losing power, and my flight controls are sluggish. Sarah looked at Walsh's aircraft and could see fuel streaming from holes in the wing where missile fragments had punctured the internal tanks. Her wingman was in serious trouble, but they were still deep in enemy territory with no immediate hope of rescue if either pilot had to eject. Reaper 2, how bad is it? Sarah asked. I think I can make it home, but I'm going to need help, Walsh replied. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of the engagement. Instead of trying to fight their way out of the ambush, she would turn and attack the enemy formation directly. It was an aggressive move that went against conventional tactical doctrine, but it might surprise the enemy pilots and give her formation a chance to escape. Reaper 3, this is Reaper 1, she radioed to Chun. I'm going to attack the main formation. Stay with Reaper 2 and get her home safely. Reaper 1, that's suicide, Chun protested. There are still 6 of them, and only 1 of you. That's an order, Sarah replied firmly. Get Walsh out of here. I'll be right behind you. Sarah turned her F-16 directly toward the center of the enemy formation and accelerated to maximum speed. It was a move that no rational pilot would attempt, but Sarah was counting on the shock value to disrupt the enemy's coordinated attack. Her plan worked better than she had dared hope. The enemy pilots, expecting the Americans to continue trying to escape, were caught completely off guard by Sarah's aggressive attack. 2 MiG-29s collided with each other as they tried to avoid her sudden charge through their formation. Sarah fired her remaining medium-range missiles at point-blank range, destroying 1 more enemy fighter and severely damaging another. But her ammunition was now critically low, and she was alone against 3 remaining enemy aircraft. The chase that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during training. Flying at maximum speed just a few hundred feet above the ground, she used every trick she had ever learned to stay ahead of the pursuing enemy fighters. She flew through narrow valleys, around mountain peaks, and even under a highway bridge as she tried to shake her pursuers. The enemy pilots were skilled and determined, but Sarah's intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities gave her a slight advantage. She knew exactly how tight she could turn, how fast she could climb, and how much stress her F-16 could handle before structural failure. Gradually, she began to open the distance between herself and the chasing fighters. But her fuel was running dangerously low, and she still had over 100 miles to fly before reaching friendly territory. Reaper 1, this is Eagle Base, came an unexpected radio call. We show you a single contact heading southwest at high speed. What's your status? Eagle Base, Reaper 1. Sarah replied, breathing heavily from the physical stress of the extended chase. I'm being pursued by 3 bandits. Fuel is critical, and I need immediate assistance. Reaper 1, Eagle Base. We're launching a rescue flight. Sarah's F-16 touched down on the runway at forward operating base Eagle, with less than 50 pounds of fuel remaining in its tanks. As she rolled to a stop, emergency crews surrounded her aircraft to check for damage and ensure she hadn't been injured during the harrowing escape from enemy territory. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh had made it back safely, despite significant battle damage to her aircraft. Her F-16 would require major repairs before it could fly again, but both pilot and aircraft had survived the ambush. Lieutenant Wilson had also managed to reach friendly territory before ejecting from his severely damaged fighter. He was recovered by search and rescue forces and would be back on flying status within a few days. The intelligence debrief following the mission revealed the sophisticated nature of the enemy's ambush tactics. They had used a combination of electronic warfare and careful positioning to mask their aircraft from Allied surveillance systems while setting up the trap. It was clear that the enemy air force was more capable and better organized than initial assessments had suggested. This changes everything, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison told his squadron commanders during the evening briefing. We're not dealing with a second-rate air force flying obsolete equipment. These guys are professionals, and they're using advanced tactics. Sarah sat quietly in the back of the briefing room, still processing the events of the day. She had scored 2 more confirmed kills during the engagement, bringing her total to 6 enemy aircraft destroyed in less than a week. But the cost had been high, with 3 F-16s damaged and the squadron's combat effectiveness significantly reduced. More disturbing was the intelligence report that suggested the enemy was massing additional forces for a major offensive. Satellite imagery showed large numbers of aircraft being concentrated at bases throughout the region, along with ground-based air defense systems that would make future operations extremely dangerous. We're going to be heavily outnumbered in the next engagement, Harrison continued. Our best estimate is that they can put at least 50 fighters in the air, compared to our 8 remaining operational aircraft. The numbers were sobering. Even with the superior training and technology of American pilots, a 6-to-1 disadvantage would be almost impossible to overcome. The attack came 2 days later, just as intelligence had predicted. Sarah was awakened at 0300 hours by the base alarm system as radar detected a massive formation of enemy aircraft approaching from multiple directions. All pilots to the flight line, came the announcement over the base loudspeaker. This is not a drill. All pilots to the flight line immediately. Sarah dressed quickly and ran toward her aircraft, where maintenance crews were already preparing the F-16s for immediate launch. But as she reached the flight line, she could see that only 6 fighters were available for the mission. 2 aircraft were still undergoing repairs from previous battles, and the squadron was operating well below full strength. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was coordinating the scramble from the operations center, his voice calm, but urgent as he issued instructions over the radio. All available aircraft will launch immediately, he announced. This is going to be everything we've got against everything they've got. Fly smart, fly aggressively, and bring each other home. As Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the startup procedures, she realized this would likely be the decisive battle of the conflict. If the squadron could hold off the massive enemy attack, Allied forces would have time to bring in reinforcements and turn the tide of the war. If they failed, the strategic balance in the entire region would shift dramatically. The 6 F-16s took off in formation just as the first enemy aircraft appeared on the radar screens. The attacking force was even larger than intelligence had predicted, with nearly 60 aircraft approaching from 3 different directions in a coordinated assault. Reaper Flight, this is Hammer Control, came the voice of the AWACS controller. We show multiple large formations of hostile aircraft inbound to your position. Initial count is 5-8 aircraft with more possible. You are cleared to engage at maximum range. Sarah checked her weapons loadout one final time. Her F-16 was carrying 4 medium-range missiles, 2 short-range heat-seeking missiles, and 500 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition. It was a full combat load, but against nearly 60 enemy fighters, every shot would have to count. The battle began when the first enemy aircraft came within missile range of the defending F-16s. Sarah and her squadron mates fired their long-range weapons at maximum distance, hoping to break up the enemy formations before they could coordinate their attack. Sarah's first missile struck a MiG-29 at the front of the main formation, destroying the aircraft instantly and causing the other enemy fighters to scatter in all directions. But there were so many aircraft that even successful shots seemed to make little difference in the overall tactical situation. Reaper 1, this is Reaper 3, came Captain Chin's urgent voice over the radio. I'm engaged with multiple bandits and need immediate assistance. Sarah turned toward Chin's position and saw his F-16 being pursued by 4 enemy fighters in a running gun battle. She selected one of the pursuing aircraft and fired a missile, but even as her weapon guided to its target, she could see that more enemy fighters were joining the engagement. The air battle quickly dissolved into a series of individual dogfights spread across hundreds of square miles of airspace. Sarah found herself constantly switching between offensive and defensive maneuvering as she engaged multiple targets while avoiding incoming missiles and cannon fire. Her next 3 missile shots were all successful, adding to her growing tally of enemy aircraft destroyed. But her ammunition was running low, and the enemy seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of fighters. All Reaper aircraft, this is Eagle Base, came an unexpected transmission from the base commander. We're launching our reserve aircraft to support you. 4 additional F-16s are en route to your position. The news that reinforcements were coming gave Sarah and her squadron mates new energy, but they still had to survive long enough for help to arrive. The enemy was pressing their numerical advantage aggressively, and American aircraft were being forced to fight multiple opponents simultaneously. During a brief lull in the action, Sarah took a moment to assess the overall situation. Her tactical display showed at least 40 enemy aircraft still active in the battle area, compared to only 6 F-16s. 2 of her squadron mates were reporting battle damage, and everyone was running low on fuel and ammunition. It was then that Sarah noticed something unusual about the enemy formation. The aircraft were not fighting as individual units, but seemed to be following a coordinated battle plan that was designed to gradually isolate and destroy the defending fighters one at a time. Reaper Flight, this is Reaper 1, Sarah broadcast to her remaining squadron mates. They're using coordinated tactics to separate us. We need to stay together and fight as a unit. Sarah began maneuvering to bring the scattered F-16s back into a defensive formation. It was a risky move that required her to fly through areas controlled by enemy fighters, but she knew their only chance of survival was to maintain mutual support. As she tried to reform the flight, Sarah found herself engaged in the most intense dogfight of her career. A particularly skilled enemy pilot in a MiG-29 had positioned himself between her and the rest of her squadron, and he seemed determined to prevent her from reaching her fellow aviators. The 2 aircraft spiraled around each other in a series of violent turns and climbs, each pilot trying to gain the advantage. Sarah's smaller size helped her handle the extreme G-forces better than her opponent, but the enemy pilot was clearly experienced and knew how to fight. The engagement lasted for nearly 10 minutes and covered over 50 miles of airspace as both fighters maneuvered at maximum performance. Finally, Sarah managed to reverse the fight and get behind the MiG-29, setting up for a gunshot with her 20mm cannon. Guns, 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 she called out as she opened fire. The stream of cannon shells struck the enemy fighter along its fuselage and wing, causing massive structural damage. The MiG-29 rolled inverted and began to fall toward the ground, trailing fire and debris. But as Sarah watched her opponent crash into the desert below, she realized that her aircraft had been damaged during the extended dogfight. Her left wing had taken several hits from enemy cannon fire, and fuel was streaming from punctured tanks. Reaper 1, this is Reaper 2, came Walsh's voice over the radio. Your aircraft is leaking fuel. You need to get out of here. Sarah checked her fuel gauges and realized that Walsh was right. She was losing fuel rapidly, and would soon be forced to choose between ejecting over enemy territory or attempting to reach friendly airspace with a critically damaged aircraft. Reaper flight. This is Reaper 1, Sarah broadcast. I'm hit and losing fuel. I'm going to try to make it home, but I may not get there. The reinforcement flight finally arrived just as Sarah's fuel situation became critical. For fresh F-16s engaged the remaining enemy aircraft and began to turn the tide of the battle. But Sarah was still alone and far from home, flying a damaged aircraft that might not have enough fuel to reach the runway. The final phase of her flight was a solo race against time as she nursed her crippled F-16 toward forward operating base Eagle. Enemy aircraft occasionally appeared on her radar, but the other F-16s kept them occupied while Sarah concentrated on getting home. With 10 miles to go, Sarah's engine began to surge as it ran out of fuel. She had to make a decision quickly: eject and hope for rescue, or attempt to glide her powerless aircraft to the runway. She chose to stay with her F-16, using every bit of her flying skill to stretch the glide as far as possible. The base came into view just as her altitude dropped to critical levels, and Sarah realized she would have only one chance to land successfully. The approach was unlike anything she had ever attempted. With no engine power and a damaged wing, the F-16 descended toward the runway like a 20-ton glider. Sarah had to judge her speed and approach angle perfectly because there would be no opportunity for a second attempt. The aircraft touched down hard on the runway, bounced once, then settled onto the concrete with a screech of tires and the smell of burning rubber. Sarah had made it home, but her F-16 was so badly damaged that it would never fly again. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah was surrounded by maintenance crews and medical personnel. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, and she was physically and emotionally exhausted from the extended battle. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was waiting for her as she completed her post-flight inspection of the damaged aircraft. His expression showed a mixture of relief and amazement as he approached. "Martinez, that was the most incredible flying I've ever seen," he said. "Final count shows you down 12 enemy aircraft during this deployment. That's more than some entire squadrons achieve in a full war." Sarah looked back at her battle-damaged F-16 and realized that her combat flying career had come to an end. The aircraft that had carried her through so many dangerous missions would never take to the skies again. But she had proven something far more important than her individual skill as a pilot. She had demonstrated that women could not only participate in air-to-air combat, but could excel at it under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The news of Sarah Martinez's achievements spread quickly through military aviation circles and beyond. Her story became an inspiration to countless young women who dreamed of careers as fighter pilots, and a powerful argument for expanding opportunities for women in combat roles. Years later, when historians studied the conflict, they would describe Sarah's performance as a turning point that changed forever how the military viewed women in combat. But on that hot afternoon at Forward Operating Base Eagle, surrounded by the wreckage of her F-16, Sarah Martinez was simply a pilot who had done her job under impossible circumstances. The doubters who had once claimed that women couldn't handle the demands of air-to-air combat had been proven wrong in the most decisive way possible. Sarah had not only survived, but dominated one of the most challenging aerial battles in military history. As she walked away from her destroyed aircraft toward the debriefing room, Sarah knew that her greatest victory was not the 12 enemy fighters she had shot down, but the barriers she had broken for all the women who would follow in her footsteps. To your position. Continue current heading and maintain best speed. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and continued her desperate flight toward home. Behind her, the enemy fighters were still in pursuit, but they seemed to be gradually falling behind as her F-16's superior fuel efficiency began to show its advantage. The final phase of her escape came when 2 fresh F-16s from the base intercepted the pursuing enemy fighters and drove them away in a brief but violent engagement. Sarah was finally free to continue toward home, but her aircraft was running on fumes, and she wasn't sure if she had enough fuel remaining to reach the runway. As Forward Operating Base Eagle came into view in the distance, Sarah realized that her fuel gauges were reading nearly empty. She would have to attempt a dead-stick landing if her engine quit before she reached the runway. But she had made it this far through skill, determination, and perhaps a little bit of luck. As she lined up for her final approach to the runway, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez knew that she had just survived one of the most challenging air battles in modern military history. The question now was whether her damaged wingman had made it home safely, and what the enemy's next move would be in this escalating conflict. Her aircraft and guided perfectly to its target. The MiG-21 exploded just as it crossed into enemy territory, becoming Sarah's fourth confirmed kill of the engagement. Fox 3 Alpha 2. That's a kill, she announced with satisfaction. Outstanding shooting, Alpha 2, Thompson replied. Alpha Flight, let's head home. We've done enough damage for one day. As Sarah turned her F-16 toward home, she took a moment to assess the results of the battle. Her flight had engaged a superior number of enemy aircraft and emerged victorious, shooting down multiple fighters and preventing them from reaching their intended target. More importantly, they had all survived the engagement, although Stevens would need significant aircraft repairs. The flight back to forward operating base Eagle was quiet, with each pilot lost in thought about what they had just experienced. Sarah found herself replaying key moments from the battle, analyzing her decisions, and thinking about what she could have done differently. When they landed at the base, they were met by intelligence officers and maintenance crews eager to debrief the mission and prepare aircraft for the next potential engagement. Sarah climbed down from her cockpit feeling exhausted but also exhilarated. She had proven to herself and others that she could perform under the extreme pressure of air-to-air combat. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was waiting for the pilots as they completed their post-flight inspections. His expression was serious but pleased as he approached Sarah. Martinez, that was exceptional flying out there, he said. For confirmed kills, and you saved Stevens' life. Outstanding work. Captain Thompson, who had been skeptical of Sarah's abilities for so long, walked over and extended his hand. I owe you an apology, he said simply. You flew like a veteran out there. I'm proud to have you as my wingman. Sarah shook his hand, feeling a sense of validation that she had worked years to achieve. But she also knew that the battle was probably not over. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were regrouping and planning additional attacks. The real test of her abilities was still to come. The next phase of the conflict would push her skills and determination to their absolute limits, and the margins for error would be even smaller than they had been today. As maintenance crews swarmed over her F-16 to prepare it for the next mission, Sarah Martinez allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had proven that a woman could not only fly in combat, but excel at it. The doubters who had questioned her capabilities would have to find new arguments, because her performance in battle spoke for itself. But, deep down, she knew that her greatest challenge still lay ahead. The enemy would be back, and next time they would be ready for the tactics that had worked so well today. Sarah would need to be even better, even faster, and even more determined if she wanted to survive what was coming. Flights are 30 miles behind you and closing. You need to engage now to prevent the hostile aircraft from reaching their target. Thompson acknowledged the transmission and gave his final instructions to the flight. Alpha Flight, we're going in. Engage targets at maximum range and break left after your first shot. Stay with your wingman and watch for leakers. Sarah double-checked her weapons systems one final time as the enemy aircraft appeared as small dots on the horizon. In a few seconds, she would fire her first shot in anger, launching a missile at an enemy pilot who was trying to kill her and her fellow aviators. The engagement began when Thompson's first missile streaked away from his aircraft toward the lead enemy fighter. Almost immediately, the organized enemy formation dissolved into chaos as aircraft scattered in all directions to avoid the incoming weapon. Fox 3 Alpha 1, Thompson called out, using the radio code for a radar-guided missile shot. Sarah acquired a target and fired her own missile at a MiG-29 that was turning toward them. Fox 3 Alpha 2, she radioed as the weapon guided toward its target. The air battle had begun, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover whether years of preparation had made her ready for the reality of aerial combat. Around her, the sky filled with aircraft maneuvering at impossible speeds, each pilot fighting for position and survival in a three-dimensional battle that would determine the fate of thousands of people on the ground below. As her first missile struck its target, and the enemy MiG-29 exploded in a ball of fire and debris, Sarah realized there was no turning back. She was no longer a student or a trainee. She was a combat pilot, and the battle was just beginning. Harrison studied her for a moment. "There's something else you should know. We've received intelligence suggesting that tensions are increasing in several regions around the world. There's a real possibility that this squadron could see combat in the near future. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. That's why I'm here." Over the next few months, Sarah worked to integrate herself into the squadron. She flew regular training missions, participated in large-scale exercises, and gradually earned the respect of most of her fellow pilots. There were still some who remained skeptical, but her consistent performance was slowly winning them over. The real test came in September 1995, when satellite intelligence detected unusual military activity in a region that was considered strategically important to American interests. Without warning, the 421st Fighter Squadron received deployment orders. They would be flying to a forward operating base near the potential conflict zone, where they would be on standby to respond to any threats that might develop. As Sarah packed her gear for the deployment, she couldn't help but think about how far she had come. 5 years earlier, the idea of a woman flying combat missions in an F-16 had been unthinkable. Now she was about to deploy to a potential war zone as a fully qualified fighter pilot. But she also knew that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. Training exercises were one thing, but real combat was something entirely different. Soon, she would have to prove that all her years of preparation had been worth it. The doubters were still watching, still waiting to see if she would succeed or fail. Sarah Martinez was determined not to give them the satisfaction of being right. In modern history,